That was absolutely amazing. That's an original composition by Dr. Takuma Itoh of University of Hawaii Manoa, where he was commissioned to take part in a series called Postcards Across America by this famous group called Invoke, and he wanted to tell the story of the picture brides. Um, you know, I wanted to talk about so the Hawaiian Historical Society created a designation called Kahu Ikena, caretakers of knowledge. And we identified Dr. Yukiko Kimura, who was trained as an anthropologist, but she focused on recording the stories of Issei women in Hawaii. So from past to present, we then designated Barbara Kawakami, who you actually saw a lot of her photos in that video. She recorded the stories of Nisei women, second generation women in Hawaii. And to the future, I look at Dr. Kelli Nakamura, who has spent a lot of her time focusing on the stories of Issei and Japanese American women in Hawaii. And I'm really excited that I can talk story with Kelli today. Thank you for taking the time to do this, Kelli.
No, thank you, Shari, for inviting me. Always fun to talk.
So, brief background of you. You are fourth generation Japanese American. Your father is from Hiroshima. Your
Mhm,
mother is Ehime Ken.
mhm.
You did your undergraduate degree at UH Manoa, where you were interested in contemporary Japanese American issues, but your passion is really about Hawaii Japanese American issues, which are very different from the mainland JA experience. And you got your PhD in American history from UH Manoa as well. So, I wanted to ask you why spend so much time researching Issei women, first generation women who came over to Hawaii?
Well, honestly, I really have to give credit to the fact that, where I am, a lot of people think of Hawaiian history being just solely really kind of focused, and rightly so, on Kanaka Maoli issues and their own history, which is absolutely incredible and absolutely vibrant and essentially needing of scholarship. But we also have to look at the other people that experience life here in Hawaii. And of course, this is a very personal story for myself, being a Yonsei or fourth generation Japanese American, and essentially kind of understand the challenges that I think not just Japanese Americans experience, but particularly women, because I really don't think their story has really been understood and kind of told. And I just think, even looking at those images that we just saw with this beautiful, you know, evocative look at what the past was like over 100 years ago, and seeing essentially these two people. So sorry. These two people, sorry, welcome to our office. Essentially, meeting across an entire ocean and really kind of um, trusting in what will actually occur. So, of course, my grandparents or great grandparents, excuse me, weren't necessarily future brides, um, but you hear these stories and you really see the challenges that I think women, immigrant women, face, and in fact still do face today, which is kind of a universal story of challenges related to gender, class, and of course their race, which all played into essentially their experiences.
And I think it's telling that the three major historians in Hawaii have all been women who have focused on women's story. And, this is something that you do as a labor of love. I mean, you're not making a lot of money, or you're not
I don't
making
make
any
any money.
money.
What money? I said, yeah. So I always say to the people that I interview, who I work with, I said, honestly, this is not a for-profit exercise. My bread and butter, my salary is paid by the University of Hawaii doing teaching, and I really do teach a lot of different subjects. But really, I got into the history, profession or degree because of my love of stories, and I think these women really have stories that honestly have not been shared or very shared very widely with people. When we look at Japanese American history, I think the history that really has been told from kind of a male perspective. So when you look at essentially veterans in particular and their absolutely critical and invaluable story, and when you look at, of course, the political history of Japanese Americans and their ascension in the post-World War II period. But a lot of people think back, to their close relationships with their mothers and their grandmothers and the traditions that have continued and still resonate here in Hawaii. I think really do play a deep part with women.
So, briefly, for people who don't know, who were the Issei women who came to Hawaii? What was the scenario of
So
them
that's a
coming over?
That's a great question. They're going to be coming around the turn of the 20th century. Really, the high period is going to be about the 1920s or so. We're really going to see essentially these women arriving from places in Japan, usually the southern regions, like Hiroshima, Fukuoka, Wakayama. These are, of course, farming communities, just like again when these immigrants first arrived in 1886. And many of these women came for a variety of reasons. So some came because of parental dictates that essentially you are going to get married. We're going to send you to meet someone. There was, of course, financial reasons. You're also going to be sent to work and remit money back. Again, a very immigrant mentality of supporting the family back at home. You're maybe even, in fact, going to be reunited with a man that you married in Japan, or at least through a proxy with the koseki system, where you essentially you write your name into their family registry and you become part of their family.
So they were
So
married without even meeting each other.
absolutely. I mean, some people
Wow.
literally met each other for the first time, and you hear all of these crazy, sitcoms of 90 Day Fiance, or people meeting each other on social media. Just looking at images or communicating with each other. When you really think about it, it's a practice that's been dating over 100 years, since we actually are exchanging images and information about each other. And we've also talked about the fact that many of these images sometimes were very deceptive. That these
So this
women
is the
would
picture brides where they're
right,
exchanging photos.
as they're exchanging photos. I mean, think about what people even do today, right now, on these dating sites. Sometimes they could substitute the image of their more attractive friend, and similarly, the men would provide photos of maybe when they were younger, or even a more um, essentially a better looking gentleman or a
They would send
friend.
someone else's photo.
Oh, they would elaborate on their success, and they would say that they're some kind of engineering technician when really they were an elevator operator.
Mhm.
So both sides, I mean, when you think about it, they're trying to put their best foot forward to encourage a better marriage prospect. But of course, the reality would have immediately hit when they're seeing each other and saying, "You're not exactly what I thought you were." And again, think about the fact that we're conjuring our own images in our mind of what our ideal partner could, should, would be. So we saw that image of the immigration station. It was really surprising for these women, to kind of be identified, sight unseen by these men. And, sometimes men didn't pick up their brides. Sometimes these brides were, in fact, kidnapped by local gangsters who then sold them into houses of prostitution. And we're going to be talking about that, of course.
So, when they came over, a lot of these picture bride marriages were successful, but you'd mentioned there were problems. So I think you had said that when they came into Hawaii, there was a fee that had to be paid. Was there a fee that had to be paid? And if the woman did not marry the man, they would be responsible for that fee?
So, we have this, so-called practice of essentially purchasing of wives, where essentially that these women would, their passage would be paid, um, and by these men who would front the money, and when upon arriving, of course, these women now have a debt, and these men would sometimes sell. So it's a practice of wife selling um, these wives into houses of prostitution or to their friend. So when we really think about it, it was kind of a very unique commodification of the marriage practice.
And rife
So
for abuse if the
and
person had
right for
no.
abuse. So
Yeah.
some people have said the really attractive brides were actually taken into houses of prostitution because they were immediately seen as more attractive for customers in a particularly bachelor community. So the ones who remained were the ones who were supposedly less attractive, or maybe there was a personal family connection between essentially these two partners.
What kind of numbers are we talking about? Like, you talk about women who were sold into prostitution, or was that happening a lot, or was that kind of not the norm?
So, I mean, those are great questions as far as, what exactly was the percentage. I mean, we don't exactly know. We've also done later statistics of, the actual marriages that actually occurred. So how many actually came, how many married, how many, of course, later divorced. And I think a lot of people would actually be surprised to see the divorce rate. Um, Sometimes they range anywhere from 20 to 30+%. And when you think about your great grandparents, or even at this point, your great great grandparents, you ever think, oh my goodness, my great great grandparents, oh, they were always together. It was wonderful. I mean, a lot of people criticize, our more recent population, saying that we have such a bad divorce rate. But I think if people really dig into their family histories, they will find maybe a grandparent or great grandparent or great great grandparent. This was their second, sometimes even third marriage.
I was
When we
smiling because I remember you telling me that if a person did marry, uh, but hated them, or hated the marriage, there was some kind of clause where they wouldn't have to repay the money.
Well, these women were very, also had their own agency. So they recognized. So some said, when I came to Hawaii, as you we saw in that beautiful, movie clip. Some, were just crying because they were so alone and they were so, without, a network of support. And you hear other stories about these women saying, it was wonderful. Back in my home village, men would never take another look at me. But when it came to Hawaii, men would travel across mountains to see another woman. So, these women were not without agency, that they would actually seek more attractive, more amenable partners to be married, or even these casual relationships that we also know occurred on the plantations.
But I think that if they were married for 1 year,
Mhm.
they could then get a divorce and not have to pay
Yeah.
any penalties.
And, we also have a kind of a strategic marriage of, some of these women came recognizing that in fact they would get married and then divorce after a certain period. So, of course, immigration officials, just like to today, are concerned that immigrants are just arriving just to take advantage of the opportunities in America. So, just like what we experience right now, you have to be married for a certain period of time to legitimize your marriage so you don't get deported. And once you did, these people immediately parted. So, they never were actually married. When you look at divorce statistics, sometimes it's kind of misleading. It's not that they hated each other, it was a purely financial arrangements where young men and young women could not actually immigrate to another country without being married or having kind of this marital status, which made them, for these immigration officials, a little bit more attractive, less transient immigrants. They were concerned
Well,
about
I
them moving.
remember you telling me that you were spending hours upon hours looking for divorce records just to
Yeah.
see if it would be like 1 year to the day or 1 year and 1 day after they came in. Were you finding a lot of those 1 year divorces?
These were just kind of immediate divorces which actually occurred. And, I honestly encourage people, go to the circuit court and look at these divorce records. Some are very short, meaning that it was clearly a personal transaction that occurred, or financial, where we just get married. Others described a litany of experiences having been married to someone who was clearly unsuitable. We talk about motivations, why did these women divorce, besides, of course, you're unsuitable, but there was allegations of domestic abuse, alcoholism, gambling. My husband's trying to sell me into a house of prostitution. You hear an incredible, um, you know, laundry list of explanations and reasons. And by the way, these are all, and they have to be, in English. So, think about the bravery of these women to kind of testify, to say, this is kind of a personal story, and this is what is happening to me in my own household, where literally I'm being chased around by a drunkard wielding a pair of scissors trying to stab me. And you do actually, unfortunately, read stories like that. They were beating me. I had to run to the neighbor's house. He's chasing me with scissors. He's trying to sell me into a house of prostitution. He's trying to sell me to his neighbor. Um, we like to romanticize, I think, the picture bride experience, but we all know marriage is very difficult, and we also know that when you get two people together, sometimes things don't work out. And clearly, what we have in the present is not as uncommon as we like to think in the past.
And I think because you're bringing up these topics like domestic abuse or even the prostitution, you actually offended. People were offended by your research findings.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've given presentations, and I've had someone stand up in the back of the room, and I think you were there when they said, my mother-in-law, or my grandmother was never like this. How dare you say they were prostitutes, and they were wise and moral women. And we have the litany of this imagery of what we think these women were. I mean, these were women and these were human beings. And I'm not saying all women were prostitutes, all women had unhappy marriages, but clearly some did. And we do have to acknowledge that, because it kind of humanizes the past. It makes us more sensitive to, I think, the challenges that people face during that time, and explains in part their behavior. So instead of saying, oh, we slander a woman saying she had loose morals, I said, well, maybe she was fleeing an abusive situation, or maybe they clearly just didn't get along.
And maybe they had no choice because they were sold or they owed
Or
money.
so they, their parents sent them. I mean, they literally could not go back. I always encourage everyone, please visit the neighbor islands. They're beautiful. Please visit, if you live on Oahu, go to the North Shore at night, and you will see just the sheer isolation of many of these plantation towns. That all you can see is, no street light, just the waves of cane and essentially the moonlight being reflected on essentially what seemed to be endless canes of, fields of cane. And you really get a sense of the isolation that these people experience. We like to have a social network, or we like to have like a family network. As myself, having a daughter, I really, benefited from the family support of not just, of course, the women, but also the men in my family. To have that and nothing else, I mean, that's incredible that these
Well,
women.
if we talk about like a typical day for an Issei woman, what was a typical day for a woman working on the plantation? Because she did double duty, right?
Absolutely. So we have this phenomenon of a double duty or double shift, double day. So these women got up early, so anywhere as early as 3, 4 in the morning, because their first job, of course, was to light the fire, start the kitchen going, start preparing meals, not just often for their husbands, but because of the pay differential, they would often seek other jobs on the plantation. So many of them became cooks for the bachelor community. So they would essentially um, create, honestly, many bentos that had to last the entire day. So when you actually think about Hawaii's bento and diet, it's kind of opposite of what we consider to be kind of true Japanese cuisine, where the majority of it is rice, a lot of protein, gravy, high calories, not too much vegetables, right? I mean, when we think about it, it's a questionable nutritional value, but it's really hearty food that can last all day out in the sun in an iron or tin can that you bring to the fields. So first, of course, they had to cook. Then they had to get up the family, get everyone going. Of course, do childcare if they in fact did have children, and with their husband at the crack of dawn, go out and work in the fields. Now think of the
And there
fact
is
that
a huge pay disparity between what women would make and what men would make, right?
absolutely. So sometimes as half, if not a third, of what these men would make. So these women would do the same kind of labor. And again, we should not romanticize the plantation experience. I mean, this is why these women were dressed, especially think about here in Hawaii, they're covering from literally head to toe because of the sun, the insects, the wind, the weather. Um, just the exposure to the elements themselves would be just incredible. And you have children, and sometimes these women would literally strap children to them, um, literally bring out children to the field, breastfeed, care for these children under these very primitive shade coverings. Um, and of course, do the same kind of labor from sun up to sundown, then come home, maybe prepare the ofuro, the hot bath. And of course, the gentlemen have to go first. And these women, of course, would be cooking dinner in the meantime, caring for the children. And maybe then they could take a bath and do the laundry. And that's what they did in the evenings often. They did the
And not to
laundry.
mention, like the chores is not stuff, it's boiling water to do the laundry. It's putting in coals to iron. These are all very labor intensive things that they had to do, right?
I mean, even thinking about creating the ofuro, the bath. I mean, I know someone whose, great grandfather on Maui basically used to get his old Chevrolet car and drive around the neighborhood with branches, and he would spend all day creating the ofuro. I mean, it's a labor intensive. I mean, you could just see, you know, old Japanese gentlemen doing this, just going around the neighborhood just to get the wood to do that, just to create the fire for cooking. We're talking about, very caustic lye soap. We're talking about huge iron vats, and not just simply washing the clothes, but also, of course, rinsing them out, drying, and then ironing, and then folding them, and then delivering them.
I
So,
thought I
these,
read somewhere that they used to beat some of the clothes too with a big stick.
I know there's a local company here that sells these red shirts, so, the red dirt shirts, and I said, oh my god, I can never buy that because I still remember my grandparents in Kauai saying, oh my god, we could never get out that red dirt. I mean, you just constantly physically have to just work it out. So these tourists are buying these red dirt shirts and saying, look, I'm from Hawaii, and we're like, you understand that people working on the plantations looked at that and with horror and said, "Oh my God, how are you going to clean that, or how are you going to iron that?"
Things have definitely changed, haven't they?
Right? We're not going to mention the local company, but there are a number of local
Right.
companies that have those red dirt shirts.
So, for women working in the plantation, I mean, they were paid peanuts compared to the men. So there were less typical work that Issei women had the chance to do. One of
Absolutely.
them was barbering. Can you tell us about that?
So, these women were very entrepreneurial. Many of them, in fact, took on other jobs, professions. Some apprentice while actually engaging in plantation labor. So often, essentially, these women would work in the family friends or their distant relatives, their own barbershop, learn the trade, also get paid minimally for the same or equal job, work alongside men, again, also for peanuts. But they could apprentice in that way. I mean, literally, these women would be sent to live with other families, and that's how you would earn your keep. I mean, you hear about this that they would send usually second children or daughters away to live with another family, gain the profession. In lieu of actually paying rent and board, you would help out the mother, the okasan of the family, also work in the shop. So barbering for many years, in fact, was a profession dominated um, by women. And think about even now, still today, many hair care salons, nail salons, personal beauty services, are dominated by immigrant women. Another profession that they also did, we were kind of laughing about this before, prostitution. I mean, it was a profession, and in lieu of hard labor, we encourage people to please do also read the Holy Holy Bushi songs, the plantation cane songs.
I think I
And
have to clarify that we were laughing because of the bluntness of the Holy Holy Bushi
yes,
song,
I
not
mean,
about prostitution.
no, I mean that's after that. Thank you for making that clarification. That we were, we like to romanticize to think that these were such moral, upstanding individuals. They're, singing to have the cadence for the work and to put in a good days of labor. But you hear stories about, these are very subversive songs, also of course sung in Japanese with a mix of pidgin, Hawaiian, and other English words.
So Holy
Um,
Holy Bushi were songs that were sung on the plantation. They were sung in Japanese, so the supervisors or the lunas didn't know what they were saying, and that's
Correct.
where the subversiveness came in, right? Because when you
Absolutely.
look at the translations, some of them are very blunt, and
Blunt. Some of them will, talk about throwing the Luna off of his horse, talk about the work conditions that, I'm demoralized. Others will talk about essentially, I drink all day and I sleep all night, and that's why the Luna is chasing me. Others will talk about the sexual relations that occurred on the plantations. And again, as you mentioned, you know, we were laughing at the subversiveness, the cleverness of it, because these women and men were singing these songs, saying, for example, the women, if I sleep with a Chinaman, I get paid $1 compared to doing laundry for 10 cents. What is an hour of laundry? Is it I could just lie down for 10 minutes or so, even less, and get paid the same amount of money. So
part
and
of it was just the shock that this is what they're singing. You
oh
know,
yeah,
I still have that stereotype of the Issei women. It doesn't fit what I had in my head of what they would be like, but this is blunt, right?
right. I mean, we're talking about, some of them describe sexual acts, and by the way, they're not just in the some of them we do believe actually were calling out these songs to not just poke fun at the men, but maybe solicit future partners, saying things like, my husband will be out. Please come over when he is gone. We can have fun. But you also see the men responding, saying things like, um, you may think that you are so attractive, but you really should, you really have to look at yourself. So the men would respond. So it was kind of this, back and forth verbal wordplay that's going on between the men and the women. So the men knew what was going on, and the men also responded, as did the women. So it's this unique kind of sophistication that I don't think we also give the Issei credit for. I mean, we're talking about, honestly, plantation folk. We're talking about farmers, often illiterate or very low level of education. Um, we're not talking about highly educated, learned, cultured individuals we like to romanticize ourselves as. These are the people that had to leave Japan because they owed taxes or they were pushed off the land. These were farmers. We're talking about a hardy stock. When you look at these women, these are not these willowy, pale skin, tall Japanese. We're talking about local people who are shorter, darker, stockier. You know, these are women who could clearly, honestly, take on the burden of plantation work and bear children. So when you look at these women, I mean, they are often very substantial because, I was actually looking at the photos and I was counting how many children, like, oh my God, that family has four, that family has six. You can see from the adult child to they're literally holding one in, you know, the cradling in their arms. So you can see the incredible number of children that these women had and think there's no childcare. Some we do know were also midwives, but think about the fact that you're giving birth often in the fields and you needed to be kind of this hardy stock, a little bit, more substantial in the hips to be literally giving birth and going to work the next day.
Well, and it looked like there wasn't a lot of break between children either, just every year giving birth to
Right.
children. I
And
think I think one of the things though is I want to emphasize, so like when it comes to prostitution, a lot of it was women didn't have a choice. If
yes.
their husbands sold them, if the arranged marriage person didn't pick them up at the dock and kind
Hmm.
of abandon them,
Hmm.
they owed money and they didn't
Correct.
have any options. Like you said, the pay disparity was so bad that I don't think they had many choices available to them, right?
No, I mean, it wasn't something that women, we do know there were some prostitutes that came along, in the first wave of immigrants. We do actually know that. But, most women did not engage in prostitution voluntarily. Also think about the fact that there's an age difference between spouses. So, think about these women being widowed at a relatively young age. What kind of occupation are they going to do? What kind of, economic opportunities when you have a whole family literally to feed? So, we should emphasize the fact that prostitution was not the immediate vocation or the first choice for these women, but really it was their last resort. And, you do hear stories about houses of prostitution in Ivale, which is kind of next to downtown, between the airport. There were, noted houses of prostitutions. There were prostitutes that regularly would traverse the different plantation camps. So when I tell my students the majority of prostitutes, in the early 1900s were in fact Japanese women, people are horrified. I said, but think about the racial and economic and also, of course, um, gender disparity on the plantations. These were the immigrant women who were coming. We don't see other large waves of women arriving to the islands, until much later. And they're going to be just a very different group of women. So the early pre-World War II, the largest number of prostitutes, in fact, on Hawaii's plantations were Japanese. And these were
Just
women
because of the numbers.
because of the numbers, because of the immigration patterns, because of the gender disparity, the wage disparity, as you mentioned. And it is not something that we assume that these women would voluntarily engage in. Um, some of them were fleeing domestic abuse situations. So,
So you also mentioned that Issei women, it was acceptable for them to be midwives. Can you
mhm.
talk about that a bit?
So we do know that some women actually came with professional degrees, to meet the needs of the plantations because clearly, the plantation owners were in fact, encouraging families to be created because it provided more stability within the labor force. So, of course, if you have families, if you have husbands, if you have wives, you often have children, and you want to make sure, of course, that these women would be taken care of, the children would be taken care of. You want a sustainable population. So, we do see the arrival of educated women arriving, and that provided a very unique opportunity
When you
because
say educated women arriving, so they got training in Japan?
they got training in Japan. They would arrive, to Hawaii, with the specific understanding that they're going to be serving or working as midwives. We do see them essentially marrying, often plantation workers, and traversing across the plantation fields. And they would be welcomed in the various ethnic camps that actually existed because they did provide medical care, often cheaper than white or Western doctors, and definitely cheaper than even, in fact, Japanese doctors. When you think
So
about these
again, then majority of the midwives on the plantation would be Japanese then?
Japanese. So we do have, you know, great scholarship talking about, looking at these midwives and their contributions. Um, but it really was kind of, a not well compensated profession compared to actually when you think about medical degrees. These plantation peoples often paid, these midwives with chickens or vegetables or, same thing that we do here in Hawaii. I mean, we like to joke about, the customs, but, you should know that if you have a fruit tree, you should bring fruit and you distribute it either at work or to your neighbors and everyone knows, right? Same thing
Right.
to reciprocate. reciprocate your appreciation. You share food, you provide chickens. But we also know that these women became repositories of community knowledge because they're the ones that recorded the birth, the death, you know, the life of these families in the plantations. So they really offer an incredible record of families and what happened. Were there stillborn births? Were there healthy children? Was this someone's second marriage? You see this incredible registry of community life, and so you always hear fondly from people, whether it be the Portuguese, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Hawaiians, or even the white plantation owners welcoming these women into the plantations because they knew what they were there for.
I was told that if the midwife was super busy, like nonstop births back to back to back, and they wouldn't have time to turn in the paperwork, people would have two birthdays.
Yeah,
They would have their actual birth, and they would have their official birth from the paperwork that could have been turned in months later.
months later, right? So you're absolutely right. So some people said, I don't exactly know when I was born or what did we do actually celebrate, because these women were busy. I mean, you
Yeah.
had to register births and deaths and baptisms and all this other stuff, and you're literally going from sometimes one part of the island to another. These women often would be provided transportation by the plantation owners or by the workers themselves. I mean, everyone knew what these women were there for. But you're right, people had questionable birthday dates. Wait, how many birthdays do you have? Well, that's what they wrote down, and this is when I know I was born. And it's this crazy, of course, only in Hawaii plantation history that would make sense if you actually understood what was going on.
I was giving a talk once and I mentioned this and I asked, oh, who has two birthdays? And I was so surprised. At least a dozen people raised their hand to tell me, yeah, I celebrate two because I have two. And they were actually kind of proud of it.
Yeah. And we all laugh and we said, yeah, that makes sense. What happens and what goes on. On the plantations, it's a very different kind of experience and what we kind of like to romanticize. So, when we go
I
to name
thought it
out,
would be days or weeks after, but some of them
oh
was
no,
months, like
months.
way later, right?
Yeah, I mean, way later. So we had two birthdays here and there. It just whenever she got around to it, and people still fondly remember these midwives for the services that they provide to the communities. And again, they were welcome. Many of these camps were ethnically divided. For people who may not know, there's a Japanese camp, there's the Filipino camp, there's the Korean camp. These women would be welcomed in all parts of the camp because they did provide not just midwife service, but also medical treatments and medical services.
What happened to all that documentation they did that, you're talking about? They were documenting marriages, births, and things like that.
So this is where, I love to come on these kind of programs and give a public service announcement and say, if you're the families of these midwives, please do not discard, their journals, their personal records. Some of them use it for bookkeeping, just to kind of, it's kind of this informal bookkeeping of, I gave birth and they paid me, or, this. So they did it as bookkeeping services. So if you're one of these, families, number one, please do not discard old plantation photos. Please do not discard old plantation clothes or even implements like cooking, implements or pots or even those bento tins. And please definitely do not discard these records because they really do um, offer a slice of history that really is not replicated anywhere else.
So, with all the research that you have done on Issei women, what lessons have you learned from their stories? What has
I think
impacted you the most, do you think?
I think it's greater respect for the experiences of women in general, and kind of reframing the experiences of Japanese Americans, not just to be just solely or about the military exploits of men, which of course is important and valuable, but look at the struggles and challenges that these women face. I mean, it was a very unique set of circumstances, and rightly they should be honored. We shouldn't romanticize their experiences because, in fact, they were pretty terrible that we just know. But to really look at the resiliency of these older generations and really the ingenuity, the creativity, I think really resonates with us even still today. So right now we're going through very difficult circumstances. And when you see the reaction of the older folks, they just, they often take it in stride. It's the younger people who are fighting it, right? So the older people, I think they have perspective and they understand that things aren't fair and things aren't right, but they're going to get through it. And so I really have, as I'm learning about them, I think I have greater respect. She now, of course, having my own daughter, you really appreciate, like, oh my God, I can't believe they had to strap the kid on their back, and you had to cook, and I mean, think about diapers, right? I mean,
Or even give birth and go back to work the next day,
that's
right? And
incredible, right? I mean, you hear stories about these women saying, we had cloth diapers, and we had to wash everything out, and then of course the kid poops or pees, and wash it again, and it's this never-ending cycle. And when you think about how many children these women had,
you're not allowed to be sick. You can't
and
rest
you're
and
not sick,
yeah.
and you can't grumble, and you are going to be, I hate to say, relying upon the assistance of the older children to help you out. And you see these women often pregnant for a good 20 years. I mean, when you think about it, they're going to be arriving in their teens and in their 20s all the way to their 40s. You're pregnant for almost 20 years. That's incredible.
I think what I really appreciate about your research is, as you said, we do have a stereotype. We tend to gloss over and not look at things that might not be so palatable. But I think it's a disservice to these women and what they went through to not really look at what they had to go through realistically, grittily, and just make sure that we tell the stories so it's not forgotten, right?
And to also, I think, give the next generation a break a little bit here. I mean, we always have that. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I mean, just to live up to the stereotype of the quiet but hardworking Issei plantation worker, then the valiant, decorated Nisei veteran, and then of course the third generation and the fourth generation. It's a lot of pressure on the next generations to live up to these honestly unreachable ideals. I mean, no one wants. I said, I do not want, our to go backwards and live on the plantation. That's not what the message is, but to really kind of appreciate where we are, where we have been,
Well, the
and
gratitude for what they went through so that we could have this privilege, right?
yeah, I mean, I just, what always strikes me is that we were chatting in the chat and saying, my God, look how young they are.
Yeah,
And
they
they're
look
these
like children.
pale, white skin, hair up to, and then you see what they look like now. You're like, you could see what they, how they are, of
Years.
course, progress and change, but you see that clearly they've been out in the sun, they've had a hard life of working and working and sacrifice. So, my God, these are honestly what we would consider to be children. I mean, not even 21 in many instances. And then having this incredible experience and giving birth all the way throughout, or having these families. And, I was looking at that other woman. She's over 100 years old. It's like, my God, that's incredible.
Hey, Kelly, we have a question
Yep.
from Cho. Said, thank you so much for sharing these stories. They're beautiful to hear. Can you tell us anything else about interethnic relations between Japanese women and Okinawan, Chinese, Korean women, etc.?
That is a perfect question, because that is something that I encourage everyone to always do research on, because the challenge is, and this is what we see also in the divorce records, we do know that Korea was in fact conquered by Japan during this time. So many Koreans were mistakenly identified as Japanese in immigration records. So when you look at essentially the marriage and divorce records, the names aren't what we consider to be Japanese. They're clearly Japanese, Korean, or something else, where these women, because they didn't know that there was a difference. These individuals being, of course, immigration officials. Um,
But I think, if you look at the what happened between Korea and Japan, the tensions, did that carry over when, these Japanese and Koreans came over to Hawaii? Like
yeah,
for the women.
absolutely. I mean, we talked about also the experiences of Okinawan women. So we have a dual discrimination of them being recognized as being not quote unquote Japanese, or not being Japanese enough. And as such, you also hear the experiences. It really comes out with Korean women, Okinawan women. They said we faced multiple discriminations because we were recognized as being not Japanese. Essentially, traditional Okinawan women had tattoos when they got married. That was looked down upon. The kinds of foods that they serve would also be essentially a point of ridicule, their language, their dialect. So we see these particular women just like the Koreans, suffering an additional burden of being duly discriminated within the ethnic community. So,
Well, I
we
mean,
also,
it's important to
yeah,
note that Okinawan women came over much later than the
yes,
Japanese in Hawaii. So when you talked about the camps, there was Okinawan camps where
yeah,
the Okinawans were completely separated,
separate.
like everyone else was.
Hmm.
But it's interesting that they weren't added into the Japan camp. They had their own separate
Their
camp.
own camp. So, we look at, for example, the records of the Susanna Wesley home out in Kalihi, which also served as a home for domestically abused picture brides. I mean, they really did acknowledge it's either signed for Japanese and Korean women. I mean, they were identifying and actually beseeching particular groups, knowing that they actually needed their services. So you see these kinds of, visual evidence that there was recognition of this, and that these Korean women in particular and these Chinese women suffered from additional discrimination, not being part of the dominant Asian group at this particular time.
And
And you're
you didn't see a lot of intermarriage between
no
Japanese and Okinawan
Japanese and
women either.
Okinawans at this time. I mean, I still remember, my grandmother's family. It was just scandalous that, one of her sisters would marry this beautiful Hawaiian Chinese gentleman, and both sides were threatening to disown. I mean, it was not just the Japanese side; it was both sides saying, "Oh my God, how could you marry that person?" Well,
Right.
it was one of the longest lasting marriages. It had a very happy relationship. She's, this Auntie Yoshiko's, 4'8" little Japanese woman who's a matriarch of this huge, clan out in Waianae. You see discrimination on both sides, and it was scandalous to say that you're going to be marrying an Okinawan or marrying a Korean or marrying a Hawaiian, or
I
essentially
think
not.
what's staggering is that, so like, this happened with my dad's brothers. They
Mhm.
married Japanese women, and there was some tension about that. And that's not that long ago.
No,
And it's just mind blowing that you think history is something hundreds of years ago, and it's not. It
you know,
happened fairly recently.
I talked to an Okinawan American, and she said, when I came to the University of Hawaii and I studied, and people immediately identified that, oh, you have an Okinawan name, and she says, is there a difference here? Oh, yes, there's a difference. And as someone from the mainland, she had to be kind of introduced to kind of the unique understandings of back in the day, but not that far back in the day. There was a real discrimination or hesitancy to intermarry even within essentially Okinawan and within the Japanese community.
But that being said, there was a lot of mingling on the plantation between the women. And that's where you really see our cuisine really changing. So you had the Portuguese women using their forno to make Portuguese bread, sharing it with the Japanese women who would maybe give them sukemono or teach them rice dishes. And so it was, to me, the women on the plantation that really bridged across these different backgrounds and started sharing, their culture with each other. And I think that went a long way with Hawaii's multicultural identity, where, we grow up eating all the like Portuguese sausage, or, it's like normal for us to
Mostly,
know all of it,
right?
right?
We joke with our mainland friends who come down here, and they're invited to local potlucks, and the spread is just, what are you guys eating, right? You have musubis, you have lumpia, you have kimchi, you have you know everything down the line. You're like, what are you all? And oh my God, so and so bought kalbi today, and everyone's just going nuts over this. And I said, I think you're absolutely right to say that food, but I think women bridge the cuisine. So I'm doing studies about plantation food, and I said, it was really the women and their personal family gardens, and they were bringing over these culinary traditions that would later inspire great male cooks, chefs, families, to really pursue a culinary career. And of course, sadly enough,
The art, the ones like Alan Wong, Roy
absolutely,
Yamaguchi.
they
Absolutely.
said, who was the one that was influencing? Oh, it was my mother and my grandmother. I used to watch them cook and clean fish, and you know we were the men knew not to go into the kitchen because it was just the women are doing their thing. You do see these traditions that women do bring along, not just religious traditions or cultural traditions, but just personal behaviors, personal traditions. Um, you know, I still remember, my grandmother and grandparents, teaching, please do not put your hashi, your chopsticks, right? Don't do that. Don't share food with your chopsticks because,
Oh man,
you
my
know,
uncle Yutaka was so
yeah,
upset that my chopsticks crossed at the end that he
yes,
sat down with me for hours making me practice. But I can use chopsticks properly now thanks to uncle, right?
right. I mean, these are the traditions that I think, these unspoken traditions that people bring. They're not just coming to Hawaii just to work and labor, but in doing so, um, I still remember going to college up in the mainland, and it was just I had to go to a professor's house, and I said, wait, we take off, we leave on our shoes, but you have white carpeting, and he's like, no, come in, and I just it was it was crazy. I said, but no, it's fine, and it's just to understand kind of that cultural understanding of
Right.
that.
Well,
If you
I
ever
want
put
to thank you a lot, Kelly. I think, as I said before, you are like a caretaker of knowledge. And, you are focusing on a topic that not many people really spend their time on because, like you said, it's not going to make you a ton of money, right? And it is a labor of love for you. So I really appreciate the research that you do. And I do want to mention that you are currently really fascinated by looking into the internment sites that were on all of the Hawaiian Islands, not just Oahu. And you've
yes.
been working on this for years, yeah?
So the only island I haven't visited yet is Niihau, and just to look at on it, I mean, because it is what it
Did
is.
Ni'ihau have a
We
internment
don't see
site?
any. We don't see any right now.
Okay.
But pretty much, I've been to the rest of the islands, looked at the incarceration sites, trying to recover kind of a community history of internment or incarceration. Of course, a great deal of attention, rightly so, has been placed on mainland incarceration. And there has been a survey of the various sites, but really I'm looking at the community impact of these sites because they were literally located, for example, in Lanai. We have Lanai Jail, which is around the corner of Dole Park, literally on one of the corners. So internment was a public spectacle, to be perfectly honest, that the community, in fact, did witness.
And to make a plug for a future Tadaima, you are talking with Kimiko about doing a session
Yeah.
that focuses entirely on your research on the internment sites on all the Hawaiian Islands. So
Yes.
look for that in a future segment.
And
So
yeah,
I know that you always like doing your historian plugs. Um, what do you want people to be looking for when they're going through their family documents and what to do with it?
well, first off, and I'm doing this with my own family. My mother and my grandmother, who's now 90. I said, if you have family photos, the first thing you should do is write people's names and approximate date and location. Later generations are not going to know who these people are, so please help them out by writing who they are, approximately what occasion or what days, because of course photographs, particularly in the previous generation, I mean, really captured often special events or moments. Like I have in our family a picture of the first gas station that they actually opened. Right, these beautiful, or we had a family member who was a team member of the Asahi baseball team here in Hawaii, and they could actually, recognize and identify who these people are. Please do that. Please identify your family members. And I know this seems kind of weird, but what we historians are looking for is not just, famous people. We're looking at backgrounds, looking at what people were wearing, like the kind of occasion. So, for example, I went to Molokai and I found one of the first pictures of Kaunakakai jail from the Mikami family who was running the first pharmacy. And the father just had a camera and he was just taking pictures around town. So first off, you don't think it's important, but look at also the background and what you're looking at. Please do not discard any plantation memorabilia, whether it be clothing, um, tools, bento boxes, the bento tins. Please do not do that. Um, and ask around. It really is something that you think, oh, it might not be important. But I just had someone volunteer to give me a copy of one of the camp reunions. They also have camp reunions that were happening, the Jinkai, Kenjinkai picnics. They had, programs. Please save that. I'd love that because, these people
So
were
what I'm
just,
hearing is save it and then send it to Dr. Kelli Nakamura.
yeah, basically. And then you can see that's why I put my folders in the back and people are like, what is there behind you? I said, It's my research. You can see it. It's just terrible. Um,
Dr. Kelli Nakamura at Kapiolani Community
Like
College.
community college. Well, it's really a hoarder, as you can tell, and she organized information. But we really are looking for the plantation life. We're looking for again stories of Okinawan Korean women, Chinese women who labored and worked on the plantations, just experiences and voices of women. I'm looking at food. I'm looking at internment or incarceration sites. Um, so my interests are is really diverse just because I'm interested in a lot of things.
And just so that people know what else they can send to you, you research labor history, strikes, sports,
Sports,
internment,
everything.
women, food surveillance, and newspapers. So, oh, and
Paper,
women in Buddhism.
Buddhism. If you want to see the role of women, just look at pictures of the Buddhist church. I mean, they have the one minister is surrounded by like 50 women who were caretakers of the church. And so I think history is so fascinating. I don't think you can limit it to one, and I think Hawaii's history really has something to offer the world, not just kind of in a tourism kind of bent, but really to capture the unique racial mixing and dynamics. And if not, just go over to Sherry's and have a potluck and see what kind of food emerges at a local potluck, and you see like, oh yeah, there's a lot of starch, and people represented something, right?
I'm sorry. We have spaghetti with a scoop of rice in Hawaii.
Yes, and
We're
mac salad.
hardcore start.
And macaroni salad, which I'm also trying to research the origin of why would you have a macaroni salad in a plate lunch, which means basically food in a box.
Yes.
So
Well,
I'm
when
trying
you
to
find out, please share.
yes.
So I think I'm going to wrap it up. And is there anything else you want to tell people?
No, I just want to say thank you to the organizers for Kimiko Mar and of course you for reaching out to Daima. Really, you guys are doing a fantastic job of preserving and really welcoming people into another kind of entry into Japanese American history. It's so inclusive. We don't want to shut anyone out, so please, if you are interested in this, pursue it. I mean, the field is wide open, and I was talking to Sherry saying, I wish I had other contemporaries, younger people too, to join us in recovering. It's a personal history for people, but I just want to say thank you very much, Sherry and Kimiko, for inviting me for this great opportunity.
And thank you for all the research that you've done. And, I also want to thank Dr. Takuma Itoh, his amazing original composition telling, it's a tribute to the picture brides. I think Kimiko posted a link to it. It's really good to watch it a couple of times because it does just really hit home, and it's storytelling in a very different way, and I think a very powerful way. So if you missed it, it played in the beginning. It is available on YouTube, and it is worth the 16 minutes that it takes to watch and listen to it. So I will actually close things out, and I'm actually going to hop over to Kelly's office because I have food for you.
I'll come over because I was gonna get food too, so don't worry. I'll come over to yours.
It's a very Hawaii thing. We have to celebrate
We
food.
share again. We share food in gratitude and thanks, and we eat all the time. So please come over and eat with us next time.
Aloha.